Bjorn the Ironwolf commanded fear across every fjord and coastline, from Norway to the Irish seas. His axe had split 1,000 shields, his longships had claimed countless treasures, and his name alone could empty entire villages before his warriors even made landfall. But there was one battle the mighty Viking could never win, keeping a woman in his bed longer than a handful of nights. They came drawn by his reputation and gold, stayed long enough to sample his fierce passion, then vanished like morning mist when they discovered the man beneath the legend was too intense, too demanding, too much for any ordinary woman to endure, until Astrid arrived. Round where others were thin, bold where others were timid, she looked him straight in the eye and declared something no woman had ever dared say. But what could make a woman choose to stay when all others fled? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you, the Great Hall of Bjorn. The Ironwolf stretched longer than 3 longships placed end to end. Its soaring timber frame carved from ancient oaks that had witnessed centuries before the first Viking ever set sail. Massive hearths at either end threw dancing shadows across walls, adorned with shields, weapons, and tapestries that told the tales of his countless victories. The high seat from which he ruled sat elevated above the rest, carved from a single piece of black oak and inlaid with silver runes that proclaimed his lineage and conquests. It was a throne that spoke of absolute authority, yet for all its grandeur, it remained painfully solitary. His warriors filled the long benches below, men who had followed him through storm and battle, who knew the weight of his axe and the fury of his charge. They were loyal beyond question, bound to him by shared blood spilled on foreign shores and treasure divided fairly among them. Yet even they whispered when they thought he could not hear, their voices carrying the puzzled tone of men trying to solve a riddle that made no sense. How can a man who commands armies of berserkers fail to command a single woman's heart? Muttered Thorek One-Eye, his grizzled face creased with confusion as he shared ale with his sword brothers. Perhaps the gods cursed him for some forgotten slight, suggested Olaf the Red, absently fingering the hammer pendant at his throat. A man should not be so skilled in war, yet so helpless in love. But Eric the Wise, eldest of Bjorn's companions, shook his grey head thoughtfully. I have watched him with women. He treats them as he treats his enemies, with overwhelming force, demanding immediate surrender. A warrior's approach to a maiden's heart rarely succeeds. Bjorn heard their speculation but said nothing, his brooding gaze fixed on the dying embers of the hearth. The most recent failure still stung like an unhealed wound. Sigrid, daughter of Jarl Magnus, had arrived 3 months ago with her father's blessing and her own eager anticipation. She was everything a Viking lord should desire, young, beautiful, well-born, trained in the domestic arts that would grace his household. For 5 days, she had seemed enchanted by his strength and passion, marveling at the treasures he showered upon her and the reverence with which his warriors treated her as their lord's chosen woman. Then she had begun to see beneath the surface, to witness the intensity that drove him, the restless energy that found no peace, even in victory. His desire was not gentle courtship but conquest, his affection expressed through possession rather than tenderness. When he spoke to her, it was with the same commanding tone he used to direct his raiders. When he touched her, it was with hands that knew only how to take, never how to simply hold. By the 6th morning she was gone, fled in the night back to her father's protection, leaving behind only a hastily scrawled note begging his forgiveness and pleading that he not pursue her. The pattern had repeated itself with devastating consistency. Each woman arrived with hope and departed with relief, as if escaping some beautiful but terrible trap. They took his gift, sampled his passion, then vanished like smoke, when they realized that loving Bjorn the Ironwolf meant surrendering not just their bodies, but their very selves to his overwhelming will. He had wealth enough to buy kingdoms, strength to conquer nations, and a reputation that made strong men tremble. Yet he could not inspire a single woman to choose him freely, to remain by his side not from fear or duty, but from genuine desire. The contradiction ate at him like a slow poison, undermining the confidence that had carried him through countless battles. The great hall that housed hundreds felt empty around him, its magnificence hollow without someone to truly share it. His high seat, carved with victories and crowned with glory, remained a throne for one, elevated above all others, but connected to none. The silver and gold that adorned every surface seemed to mock him with their cold beauty, precious metals that could buy anything except the one treasure that mattered most. Tonight, as every night, Bjorn sat alone in his splendor, surrounded by loyal warriors who would die for him, but could not solve the mystery of his solitude. The battle axe that had made him legend rested against his throne, its blade reflecting firelight like captured stars, a symbol of the violence that defined him and perhaps explained why love remained forever beyond his reach. The silver arm ring lay abandoned on the wooden chest beside Bjorn's bed, its intricate knotwork catching the pale morning light that filtered through the shuttered windows. He had commissioned it from the finest craftsmen in Hedeby, each twist of precious metal representing another victory, another conquered land. It was meant to be a gift that would bind a woman to him, a symbol of his wealth and the security he could provide. Instead, it had become a monument to rejection, left behind by yet another woman who preferred freedom. To his golden cage, Ingrid, the merchant's daughter, had worn it for exactly 4 days before, placing it carefully on this same chest and slipping away while he slept. Before her, it had adorned the wrist of Thora, the thrall girl he had freed and elevated to the status of concubine, who lasted 6 days before begging to be sold to a gentler master. Even Astrid the widow, a woman of mature years who should have understood the ways of men, had returned it after a week with tears in her eyes and apologies on her lips. Each departure followed the same pattern, as predictable as the changing of seasons. The woman would arrive full of hope or ambition, drawn by his reputation and the promise of a life elevated far above her birth. The first night would pass in passionate intensity, his desire overwhelming in its force, his need to possess complete and immediate. They would wake to find themselves claimed utterly, marked as his, in ways that went beyond the physical joining of bodies. For a few days, they would seem content, even pleased with their new status. His household servants would bow to them, his warriors would treat them with the respect due to their lord's chosen woman. They would wear his gifts, eat at his high table, and sleep in his bed surrounded by luxury beyond their previous dreams. But gradually, inevitably, they would begin to understand what it truly meant to belong to Bjorn the Ironwolf. He did not court women so much as conquer them. His conversations were commands disguised as questions, his affections expressed through control rather than tenderness. When he asked about their day, he expected detailed accounts of every moment spent outside his presence. When he gifted them jewelry or fine cloth, he expected to see it worn exactly as he specified. His love was not a partnership but an occupation, complete and absolute. The merchant's daughter had tried to explain it to him the night before she fled. "You do not seek a woman to love," she had said, her voice trembling with the effort to be gentle while delivering harsh truths. "You seek another treasure to add to your collection, another victory to display in your hall. But a woman's heart cannot be won like a battle or claimed like plunder." He had dismissed her words then as the weakness of a pampered girl unused to the strength of a true man's desire. Now, alone with her abandoned gift, he began to wonder if there was truth in her accusation. Did he love these women, or did he simply desire to own them? Was his passion genuine affection, or merely another form of conquest? The thrall girl's departure had hurt more than he cared to admit. Thora had known suffering before he claimed her, had experienced the helplessness of being property rather than person. He had thought gratitude would make her loyal, that freedom granted by his hand would bind her to him more surely than chains. Instead, She had chosen uncertainty over his protection, poverty over his wealth, because even a thrall's hard life was preferable to the golden prison he offered. "A cage made of silver is still a cage," she had whispered as she kissed his cheek in farewell. "You would keep me safe, my lord, but you would also keep me small." Even Astrid the widow, a woman who had buried 2 husbands and should have welcomed the security he provided, found his devotion suffocating. She had loved deeply before and understood the difference between passion that honored and passion that consumed. "You love like a wildfire," she had told him with sad wisdom. "Beautiful and warm, but burning everything in its path. A woman needs space to breathe, room to grow. You would have us be like hothouse flowers, lovely but fragile, existing only for your pleasure." The arm ring seemed to mock him with its beauty, crafted to symbolize the bonds of love, but serving only as evidence of his failures. Each woman who had worn it briefly and discarded it left him more confused, more desperate to understand why strength and wealth and passionate devotion were not enough to earn what he craved most, a woman who would choose to stay. The great mead horn passed from hand to hand around the firelit hall, its polished surface reflecting the faces of jarls and their retinues who had come to feast at Bjorn's table. Carved from the horn of an auroch that had gored 3 hunters before falling to Bjorn's spear, it held enough mead to satisfy even the thirstiest warrior. Tonight it served as more than a drinking vessel. It was a symbol of hospitality, a declaration that all present were welcome in his hall and under his protection. The autumn feast had drawn nobles from across the northern territories, each arriving with their finest warriors and most eligible daughters. Jarl Hakon had brought his twin nieces, both renowned for their beauty and skill at the loom. Jarl Orm's party included his recently widowed sister, still young enough to bear children and wealthy enough to bring substantial holdings to any marriage alliance. Even old Jarl Magnus had come, accompanied by 2 daughters, to replace the one who had fled Bjorn's bed in the night. The hall blazed with more light than it had seen in months. Every torch holder bore fresh flames, every brazier glowed with seasoned oak, and the great hearths roared with fires that would burn until dawn. The long tables groaned beneath the weight of roasted boar, platters of salmon, fresh from the fjords, wheels of aged cheese, and loaves of bread baked with precious wheat flour. Servants moved between the benches with pitchers of ale and wine, ensuring no cup remained empty long enough to signal poor hospitality. Bjorn presided over it all from his high seat, wearing his finest tunic of deep blue wool, bordered with gold thread, a heavy arm ring of twisted silver catching the firelight with every gesture. He played his role perfectly, the generous host, the mighty warrior, the eligible lord whose favor could elevate any woman's family to new heights. Yet beneath the performance, he felt the familiar hollow ache that no amount of feasting could fill. The eligible women had been paraded before him with all the ceremony of prize horses at market. Each father spoke of his daughter's virtues with the practiced enthusiasm of men negotiating profitable trade agreements. Beauty, fertility, domestic skills, political connections, all were catalogued and presented for his consideration like items in a merchant's inventory. "My Helga has the finest needlework in all of Vestfold," boasted Jarl Hakon, while his niece displayed a length of embroidered silk that had taken her 2 winters to complete. "She could grace your hall with tapestries that would be spoken of for generations." Jarl Orm's sister, Ragnhild, demonstrated her knowledge of herb lore by identifying the various plants used to season the evening's dishes. "A useful skill for a lord's wife," her brother noted meaningfully. "Healing knowledge can preserve a household through the hardest winters." Even the entertainment seemed designed to showcase feminine accomplishments. Young women sang ancient ballads praising heroic deeds, their voices sweet and clear above the crackling fires. Others performed intricate dances that displayed both grace and the valuable training that marked highborn maidens. Each performance was a petition, a demonstration of what they could bring to his bed and his household. Yet as Bjorn watched these careful displays, he felt more isolated than ever. These women were not choosing him. They were being offered to him like tribute from vassal lords seeking favor. Their smiles were practiced, their conversations rehearsed, their very presence calculated to achieve a specific outcome. Where was the genuine connection he craved? Where was the woman who would see past his reputation to the man beneath? The mead horn reached him again, and he lifted it high in the traditional toast. "To honored guests and lasting friendships," he declared, his voice carrying easily across the crowded hall. The response was immediate and enthusiastic. Cups raised high and voices joining in agreement. But as the evening wore on and the conversations grew more pointed about potential marriage alliances, Bjorn found himself withdrawing from the festivities even while remaining physically present. He nodded at appropriate moments, laughed at the expected jokes, and made the proper responses to veiled proposals, all while feeling like a man drowning in a sea of false smiles and calculated charm. The mead horn that should have brought joy and connection instead reminded him of the gulf between true hospitality and mere ceremony, between genuine affection and profitable arrangement. These women would come to his bed willingly enough if their families commanded it, but would any of them choose to stay when they discovered what lay beneath the legend of Bjorn the Ironwolf? The feast that was meant to solve his loneliness only emphasized its depth. Each forced smile and rehearsed compliment another reminder that he had everything a Viking lord should want except the one thing that truly mattered. The simple wooden comb lay forgotten on the furs beside her as Astrid ran her fingers through her unbound hair, the dark brown waves catching glints of copper in the firelight. It was a plain thing, carved from ordinary birchwood by her own father's hands, when she was barely old enough to need such implements. No silver inlay decorated its teeth, no precious gems adorned its spine, just honest craftsmanship meant to serve its purpose without pretense. Yet it had traveled with her through 3 different households, outlasting marriages and surviving hardships that had claimed fancier possessions. She had arrived that afternoon in the retinue of Jarl Eric the Lesser, not as his daughter or niece or any relation of blood, but as companion to his elderly wife who needed assistance with the journey. Her position was humble, her expectations modest, while the other women preened and postured for the attention of their legendary host. Astrid helped the older woman to her quarters and saw to her comfort with the practical efficiency of someone accustomed to caring for others. It was this very ordinariness that first caught Bjorn's attention. While Jarl's daughters simpered and fluttered their eyelashes, while wealthy widows displayed their assets with calculated charm, this woman simply went about her duties with quiet competence. She was not slender like the current fashion favored, her hips well-rounded from bearing children, her arms strong from years of labor. Her face, while pleasant, bore the lines that came from genuine laughter and honest tears rather than the unmarked perfection of pampered youth. When their eyes met across the crowded hall, she did not blush and look away as was proper. Instead, she met his gaze steadily, neither bold nor submissive, but simply present. There was something in her dark eyes that spoke of depths unplumbed, of a woman who had seen enough of life to know both its sorrows and its joys without being broken by either. "You are not what I expected," Bjorn had said when he approached her later, after the formal presentations were completed and the other guests had settled into drinking and boasting. "And what did you expect, Lord Bjorn?" Her voice carried the slight accent of the eastern settlements, melodious but with an underlying strength that suggested she was not easily intimidated. "Someone younger, someone more conventional." Astrid's laugh was genuine, free of the practiced tinkle that passed for mirth among court ladies. "Conventional women seem to give you difficulty from what I hear. Perhaps you need someone who colors outside the expected lines." The directness of her response should have offended him. No woman spoke so boldly to Bjorn the Ironwolf, especially not a woman of modest station, addressing a lord in his own hall. Yet instead of anger, he felt intrigued. Here was honesty instead of flattery, substance instead of surface beauty. You speak as if you know something of my difficulties. I know what any woman with eyes and ears knows. You are a man who conquers kingdoms, but cannot keep a woman content for a full season. Either you are cursed by the gods, or you approach love the same way you approach war, with overwhelming force and no quarter given. The brutal accuracy of her assessment struck him like a physical blow. Yet coming from her lips, it sounded less like criticism than diagnosis, as if she were a skilled healer examining a wound to determine the best treatment. "And you believe you would be different?" Astrid considered this carefully, her fingers absently stroking the wooden comb in her lap. "I believe I'm too old and too tired for games, Lord Bjorn. I have buried 2 husbands and raised 4 children to adulthood. I know what it means to love someone deeply and to lose them to forces beyond my control. I also know what it means to love someone whose passion burns too bright and threatens to consume everything around it." That night, when she came to his bed, it was not with the nervous excitement of a maiden or the calculated seduction of an ambitious woman. She came with the steady certainty of someone who had made a deliberate choice, her wooden comb tucked safely in the folds of her simple dress. When he moved to overwhelm her with his usual intensity, she placed a gentle hand on his chest. "Slowly," she whispered, and for the first time in his adult life, Bjorn the Ironwolf allowed himself to be guided rather than taking command. The night that followed was unlike any he had known. Not conquest but conversation, not claiming but sharing, not dominance but partnership. When dawn broke over the fjord, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Astrid still lay beside him, her breathing soft and even, her wooden comb resting on the furs within easy reach. For the first time in years, Bjorn did not wake alone. The bread loaf sat warm and golden on the wooden trencher between them, its crust crackling softly as it cooled in the morning air. Astrid had risen before dawn to knead the dough and tend the ovens, working alongside his kitchen thralls, as if she belonged among them rather than in his bed. The simple act of sharing breakfast had never held meaning for Bjorn before. Food was fuel, a necessity to be consumed efficiently before moving on to more important matters of war and rule. Yet as Astrid tore off a piece of the loaf and handed it to him, still steaming from the oven, he found himself savoring not just the taste, but the moment itself. No woman had ever made bread for him with her own hands. They accepted the luxury of his table, praised the skill of his cooks, but none had thought to contribute something of their own creation to the morning meal. "This is how my grandmother taught me," Astrid said, breaking her own portion and dipping it in honey. "She said, bread made with your own hands tastes better than any feast prepared by others, because it carries the love of the baker along with the grain." The other guests from the previous night's feast were beginning to stir in the hall below, but none had risen early enough to witness this unprecedented scene. Bjorn the Ironwolf, feared across the northern seas, sitting peacefully at a simple wooden table, sharing fresh bread with a woman who seemed utterly unimpressed by his reputation. The domesticity of it should have felt foreign, uncomfortable. Yet instead it filled him with a strange contentment he could not name. "You stayed," he said, the words carrying more weight than he intended. "I did." Astrid's dark eyes met his steadily over the shared meal. "Did you think I would flee in the night like the others? Most do. By dawn, they have remembered urgent business elsewhere or discovered sudden illness that requires them to return home immediately." Astrid chewed thoughtfully, considering his words. "Most women come to your bed expecting either a fairy tale or a conquest. When they discover you are simply a man with a man's needs and failings, they feel deceived. They wanted the legend, not the person. And you? I'm past the age for fairy tales, and I have no desire to be conquered. I came to your bed because I chose to, and I stayed because I choose to. It is really that simple." The bread seemed to taste sweeter with those words, its simple goodness enhanced by the honesty that flavored their conversation. Below them, he could hear the stirring of servants preparing for another day, the sounds of a household coming to life under his authority. Yet here in this quiet corner of his domain, authority seemed less important than the gentle intimacy of breaking bread with someone who saw him as he truly was. "The others will talk," Bjorn warned, gesturing toward the hall where his noble guests would soon gather for the morning meal. "Jarl Hakon's nieces, Orm's sister, they will wonder why you remain when they were dismissed. Let them wonder. I did not seek their approval when I chose to stay, and I will not seek their forgiveness for making that choice." The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted their quiet breakfast, and soon other guests began filing into the hall for the morning meal. Bjorn watched as eyes found them in their secluded corner, noted the whispered conversations and meaningful glances exchanged between the various jarls and their eligible female relatives. Helga, one of Jarl Hakon's twin nieces, approached with a bright smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "Good morning, Lord Bjorn. What a cozy arrangement you have here." Her gaze took in the simple bread, the modest wooden cups, the complete absence of ceremony or display. "Good morning, Lady Helga. I trust you slept well." "Indeed, though I confess surprised to find you already breaking your fast. Most lords prefer to dine in their great hall with proper ceremony." The subtle criticism was delivered with honeyed words, but its intent was clear. Astrid looked up from her bread with mild interest. "How fortunate that Lord Bjorn is not most lords, then. A man secure in his authority does not need constant ceremony to remind others of his importance." The gentle rebuke, delivered without malice, but with unmistakable firmness, left Helga momentarily speechless. She recovered quickly, offering polite pleasantries, before retreating to join her family at the high table. As the morning progressed and more guests gathered, Bjorn noticed how naturally Astrid deflected their subtle challenges and pointed questions. She neither claimed unearned status nor apologized for her presence, simply existing in his space with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged exactly where she was. The bread they had shared became a symbol of something new in his life, sustenance that nourished more than just his body, comfort that came not from conquest, but from choice freely made and honored. The embroidery hoop held taut a piece of fine linen, marked with the outline of a great tree, its bare branches waiting to bloom under Astrid's skilled needle. She worked by the light of the eastern window, her fingers moving with practiced certainty as she chose threads of green and gold to bring life to the design. It was a scene that would have been impossible to imagine in Bjorn's hall just days before, feminine domestic arts flourishing in a space dedicated to masculine pursuits of war and conquest. 7 days had passed since the feast, and still she remained. His warriors had begun to take notice, their conversations shifting from puzzled speculation to grudging respect. This woman was different from the others, and even the most skeptical among them could not deny the changes her presence had wrought in their lord and their daily lives. "She knows herbs," reported Gunnar the Bold after Astrid had treated a festering wound on his sword arm with poultices that drew out the infection better than any healer they had known. "Not just kitchen seasonings, but true healing plants. She saved me a trip to the wise woman in the valley." Eric the Wise nodded thoughtfully from his place by the fire. "She listens when we speak of raids and battles past, asks intelligent questions about tactics and enemy weaknesses. Most women's eyes glaze over when warriors share their tales, and she does not cower when the Lord's temper flares," added Olaf the Red. "Yesterday, when he shouted about the poor condition of his mail, she simply told him that metal requires care to maintain its strength, like any living thing." He stopped shouting and actually thanked her for the reminder. The domestic improvements had been subtle but undeniable. Meals appeared on time and properly seasoned, having benefited from Astrid's guidance of the kitchen staff. Linens were mended and cleaned more efficiently under her gentle supervision. Even the hall itself seemed warmer somehow, as if her presence had chased away shadows that had lingered too long in corners. but it was not just practical matters where her influence showed. Bjorn himself seemed different, still the formidable warrior, but with a contentment that had been absent for years. His morning inspections of weapons and defenses were thorough, but no longer driven by restless energy, seeking outlet. His evening meals were consumed with appreciation rather than mere necessity. "She gentles him without weakening him," observed Thorek One-Eye, his scarred face creased with something approaching wonder. "Like breaking a wild horse. You want it tame enough to ride, but still fierce enough to carry you into battle." The embroidery in Astrid's hands was taking shape, tiny stitches building upon each other to create something beautiful from simple materials. The tree's trunk grew strong and steady under her patient work, its branches reaching toward a sun she had yet to complete, but which already seemed to cast warmth across the cloth. When Bjorn found her there in the afternoon light, he paused to watch her work. The scene seemed to encapsulate everything he had been missing, not just a woman's presence, but the particular peace that came from someone creating beauty for its own sake, rather than as display or conquest. "What will it become?" he asked, settling beside her on the wooden bench. "A wall hanging for your private chamber. Something to remind you that strength and growth come from roots planted deep, not from branches that reach too quickly toward the sky." Her needle continued its steady rhythm as she spoke. "Trees that grow too fast become brittle. Those that take time to establish their foundation weather any storm." The metaphor was not lost on him. His previous relationships had been like those brittle trees, rushing toward possession without taking time to establish the deeper connections that would sustain them through difficulties. And this tree will weather storms. Astrid looked up from her work, meeting his eyes with that steady gaze that had first caught his attention. "If it is tended with patience and watered with genuine care rather than desperate need, yes. All living things thrive when they are nurtured rather than simply claimed." That evening, as they shared the evening meal in his private chambers rather than the great hall, Bjorn found himself watching Astrid's hands as she broke bread and poured ale. These were working hands, marked with small scars from needle pricks and kitchen knives, yet graceful in their competence. They created, rather than simply consumed, gave rather than only took. The embroidery hoop sat nearby, the tree growing more real with each day's work. Like their relationship, it was something built slowly, stitch by. Careful stitch, each thread chosen deliberately and placed with intention. For the first time in his adult life, Bjorn understood the difference between taking what he wanted and cultivating what he needed. The drinking cup passed between them held wine from the southern lands, its pewter surface worn smooth by countless hands, but still bearing the intricate engravings that marked it as a gift from a Byzantine merchant grateful for safe passage. Bjorn had always used it for important negotiations, the sharing of drink from a common vessel, symbolizing equality and mutual respect between parties. Tonight, as Astrid lifted it to her lips where his had just been, the gesture carried deeper meaning than any treaty or trade agreement. The test had come that afternoon in the form of Lady Sigrid's return. Jarl Magnus's daughter arrived unannounced with a small retinue, her chin held high despite the circumstances of her previous departure. Word spread quickly through the hall. The woman who had fled Bjorn's bed in the night had returned, perhaps to reclaim her place, or at least to salvage her reputation. "Lord Bjorn," Sigrid had announced formally upon entering the great hall, her voice carrying to every corner where curious ears strained to hear. "I come to speak with you on a matter of honor." Astrid had been present, sitting beside Bjorn's high seat with her embroidery, her presence so naturally established that removing her would have required deliberate action. The younger woman's eyes had fixed on her immediately, taking in her comfortable posture, the easy familiarity with which she occupied space that had once been Sigrid's domain. "Lady Sigrid," Bjorn had replied with careful formality. "You are welcome in my hall. What matter brings you here? I have come to understand that my hasty departure may have caused offense. My father suggests that arrangements might yet be made to repair any damage to our family's alliance. The carefully chosen words carried multiple meanings. An apology that was not quite an apology, an offer that was not quite an offer, a suggestion that his current situation was temporary and easily corrected. Around the hall, warriors and servants had paused in their duties, sensing the drama unfolding. Astrid had continued her needlework throughout this exchange, her expression serene and untroubled. When Sigrid's gaze turned to her with poorly concealed hostility, she had looked up with polite interest, as if meeting any other guest in her lord's hall. "And who might you be?" Sigrid had asked, her tone suggesting she already knew the answer, but required it to be spoken aloud. "I am Astrid, companion to Lord Bjorn." The simple response carried quiet dignity, neither claiming more status than she held, nor apologizing for her presence. Companion. Sigrid had repeated the word as if tasting something sour. "How quaint and temporary, I assume." The insult was delicately delivered but unmistakable. Astrid had set down her embroidery hoop and risen from her seat with unhurried grace, moving to stand beside Bjorn's chair. Her hand had come to rest lightly on his shoulder, a gesture that spoke of established intimacy and mutual support. "My arrangements are precisely as permanent as I choose them to be," Astrid had replied evenly. "I am not a young woman seeking security through marriage alliances, nor am I someone who makes commitments lightly. When I give my word, it holds." The contrast could not have been clearer. Sigrid, young and beautiful, but proven unreliable, faced Astrid, older and plainer but steadfast in her chosen loyalty. The hall had grown very quiet, as spectators recognized they were witnessing more than a simple exchange of words. Bjorn had reached up to cover Astrid's hand with his own, the gesture both protective and possessive. "Lady Sigrid, I appreciate your father's concern for our family's relationship. However, my circumstances have indeed changed, and I'm content with those changes." The dismissal, though politely worded, was absolute. Sigrid's carefully planned return had failed to achieve its purpose, and her retreat was as swift as her original departure. But not before delivering one final barb. "I hope you will be equally content when the novelty fades and you remember what you could have had." Now, in the quiet of evening, Bjorn and Astrid shared wine from the cup that had witnessed so many important agreements. The day's confrontation had tested not just their relationship, but their commitment to each other in the face of outside pressure and offered alternatives. "She is beautiful," Astrid observed without jealousy, merely stating fact. "She is," Bjorn agreed. "And young and well-born, and everything a Viking lord should want in a wife." But she left. She left. He took the cup from her hands, his fingers brushing hers in the exchange. "And you stayed, even when staying meant facing her scorn and the whispers of those who think you unworthy of this place." Astrid smiled, the expression transforming her pleasant features into something approaching beauty. "Let them whisper. The only opinion that matters to me is yours, and you have made your choice clear." The shared cup sealed their mutual understanding. They faced the world as partners, equal in their commitment, regardless of what others might think or say. The cloak clasp gleamed silver against the dark wool of Astrid's outer garment, its intricate knotwork design marking her clearly as belonging to Bjorn's household. He had commissioned it from the same craftsman who had made his own insignia, the intertwined serpents representing both protection and eternal bonds. When he fastened it at her throat that morning before the regional assembly, his fingers lingered on the warm metal, understanding that this simple gesture carried the weight of a public declaration. The assembly grounds sprawled across the wide meadow where 3 rivers met, temporary pavilions and cooking fires marking the camps of dozens of jarls and their retinues. Representatives from across the northern territories had gathered for the seasonal moot, bringing disputes to be settled, alliances to be forged, and grievances to be aired before their peers. It was here, among his equals and rivals, that Bjorn chose to make his intentions known. Jarl Magnus had wasted no time in approaching them. His weathered face creased with displeasure as he took in the sight of Astrid, wearing Bjorn's clasp so prominently displayed. Behind him stood Sigrid, her beauty marred by the tight line of her mouth as she recognized the significance of the ornament. Bjorn Ironwolf. "I would speak with you privately about matters concerning our families," Magnus declared, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to having his wishes granted immediately. "Speak freely, Jarl Magnus. I have no secrets from my chosen woman." Bjorn's arm settled around Astrid's shoulders, the gesture both protective and possessive. The silver clasp caught the morning light, impossible to miss or misinterpret. "Your chosen woman." Magnus's eyebrows rose in calculated surprise. "I was not aware you had made such a significant decision. Surely such matters warrant discussion among those whose opinions carry weight." The insult was carefully crafted, suggesting that Astrid's own opinion carried no weight, while simultaneously questioning Bjorn's judgment in making the choice without consulting his peers. Around them, other jarls and their followers had begun to drift closer, sensing drama in the making. Astrid felt the tension in Bjorn's frame, recognized the signs that preceded his legendary temper. Before he could respond with the cutting words that would escalate this encounter into open conflict, she stepped slightly forward, her voice carrying clearly across the gathering crowd. "Jarl Magnus, I understand your concern for your daughter's honor. Any father would feel protective when his child's reputation is discussed publicly." Her tone was respectful but firm, acknowledging his position while refusing to be intimidated. "However, I must point out that your daughter made her own choice to leave Lord Bjorn's protection. I have made the opposite choice, and I stand by it completely." The directness of her response caught Magnus off guard. He'd expected either submissive silence or defensive anger, not this calm assumption of equal standing in the conversation. "You speak boldly for a woman of modest birth, addressing her betters," he replied, his voice hardening with displeasure. "I speak honestly, which I have found serves better than false humility in matters of importance." Astrid's fingers found the silver clasp at her throat, drawing attention to its significance. "Lord Bjorn has honored me with his trust and protection. I honor him in return with loyalty and truth, not with what others might consider more appropriate responses." Jarl Håkon, who had remained silent during the exchange, chose this moment to interject. "Bjorn, surely you recognize the unusual nature of this arrangement? A man of your standing bound to a woman of such ordinary circumstances?" The word ordinary carried particular weight in a culture that prized exceptional deeds and noble bloodlines above all else. It was designed to sting, to make Astrid feel ashamed of her humble origins and practical nature. Instead, she smiled with genuine warmth. "Jarl Håkon speaks truly. I am indeed ordinary in birth and breeding. I have no famous ancestors to boast of, no great dowry to bring to this union. What I offer is exactly what Lord Bjorn requires: steadfast loyalty, honest counsel, and the kind of love that deepens rather than fades with familiarity." Bjorn's arm tightened around her shoulders, his voice carrying the deadly quiet that his warriors knew preceded violence. "Any man who questions my judgment questions my authority. Any man who insults my chosen womb and insults me directly. I trust I make myself clear." The threat hung in the air like the scent of approaching storm. These men had seen Bjorn in battle, knew the terrible, swift justice of his anger. Yet Astrid's calm dignity in the face of their derision had transformed what might have been seen as a moment of weakness into one of strength. The silver clasp at her throat caught the light again as she turned to survey the assembled crowd, her chin raised with quiet pride. She had claimed her place not through birthright or beauty, but through the simple courage to stand firm when others would have fled. The braided lock of hair lay coiled within the small silver locket, dark brown strands woven together with threads of copper that caught the firelight like trapped sunset. Bjorn's fingers traced the delicate metalwork before closing the pendant and tucking it inside his leather jerkin close to his heart. It was Astrid's parting gift, cut from her own head that morning, as his ships prepared for the summer raiding season. So you will not forget the color of my hair when you see golden-haired beauties in foreign lands," she had said with a smile that did not quite mask the worry in her dark eyes. "And so a part of me travels with you, no matter how far the seas take you from home." The separation felt different from any he had experienced before. In previous years, departure for the summer raids had brought only anticipation, the promise of battle, treasure, and adventure in distant lands. His hall had been a place to return to eventually, not a home to miss while away. Now, as his longships cut through the morning swells with their dragon prows aimed toward the English coast, he found himself already counting the days until his return. Eric the Wise had noticed the change immediately. "You carry yourself differently, Lord, less eager for the fight, more thoughtful about the risks. A man with something worth returning to cannot afford to be reckless with his life," Bjorn replied, his hand unconsciously moving to the locket at his chest. "The young and the desperate can gamble everything on a single battle. Those who have found what they truly value must calculate more carefully." Behind them, the Norwegian coast had faded to a thin line on the horizon, but Astrid's presence seemed to travel with them in ways both tangible and mysterious. The other ship captains had remarked on the unusual supplies loaded into their vessels: higher quality preserved foods, better medical supplies, warmer cloaks for the rowers. Astrid had overseen the provisioning personally, ensuring that the men who served her lord would be as comfortable as possible during their months at sea. "She thinks like a mother preparing her sons for a long journey," Gunnar the Bold had observed, hefting a leather sack filled with herbs for treating wounds and fever. "Most women see our departures as abandonment. This one sees them as missions to be properly equipped." The letters began arriving at their first stop in the Orkney Islands, carried by trading vessels that plied the northern routes. Astrid's careful script filled pages with news from home: which crops were thriving, how the new calves were growing, updates on the health and welfare of his people. But between the practical reports, he found deeper truths expressed in her careful words. "The hall seems too large with you gone," she wrote in the first letter. "I find myself setting aside the choicest portions of meat for you at dinner, forgetting momentarily that your place sits empty. The bed is cold, despite the season's warmth, and I have taken to sleeping with one of your cloaks for the comfort of your scent." Her honesty about missing him touched something in his chest that had nothing to do with desire and everything to do with being valued for himself rather than his possessions or position. No previous lover had ever expressed genuine sorrow at his departure, relief perhaps, or polite regret, but never this simple longing for his return. His own letters in response surprised him with their length and detail. He found himself describing not just the progress of raids and the taking of treasure, but the color of foreign sunsets, the strange customs of distant peoples, the way homesickness had become an actual physical ache in his chest. Writing to Astrid required him to see his experiences through different eyes, to find beauty and meaning in details he had previously ignored. The Irish monks fight fiercely to defend their manuscripts. He wrote from a monastery they had plundered on the western coast. "I found myself wondering what you would make of their illuminated pages, covered with designs more intricate than your finest embroidery. I have saved one for you, a book of prayers with pictures of fantastic beasts and flowering vines." The locket at his chest grew warm from his body heat as the weeks passed, the braided hair inside a constant reminder of what waited for him across the sea. His men noticed how he touched it during quiet moments, how his gaze would turn eastward toward home even, when facing west toward battle and profit, when news came of political upheaval in his territory, rival. Jarl's making moves against his holdings while he was away. Bjorn's first thought was not of his own safety or wealth, but of Astrid facing potential danger alone. The woman who had chosen to stand by his side now bore the risks of that choice, and the knowledge sat heavy in his heart like a stone. The account ledger lay open on the oak table in Bjorn's private chamber. its pages covered with Astrid's careful script, recording the summer's transactions, harvests, and household management. Each entry was precise and methodical. Grain stores measured and allocated, livestock counted and accounted for, wages paid to craftsmen and servants, tributes received from smaller settlements under Bjorn's protection. The neat columns of numbers told a story of prosperity carefully maintained and wisely expanded. Astrid had transformed the casual approach to record-keeping that had characterized Bjorn's household into something approaching the efficiency of a merchant prince's operation. Where previous stewards had relied on memory and rough estimates, she had instituted systems that tracked every ounce of silver, every barrel of grain, every tool and weapon in their extensive stores. The harvest was exceptional this year, she explained to the gathered household heads who had come to review the season's accounts. We have surplus enough to trade for iron ore from the mountain settlements, and sufficient grain to see us through even a harsh winter, with stores remaining for spring planting. Thorek One-Eye, who had served as Bjorn's informal treasurer for years, examined the ledger with the skeptical eye of a man unused to such detailed documentation. These numbers, they seem too precise. How can you know exactly how many bushels of barley we harvested? Because I had every field measured and every load weighed as it came in from the fields, Astrid replied patiently. Knowledge is power, Thorek. If we know exactly what we have, we can plan exactly how to use it most effectively. The wisdom of her approach had become apparent during a dispute with Jarl Orm over tribute payments. Where previous disagreements had devolved into shouting matches and threats of violence, Astrid had simply produced her ledger and pointed to specific entries documenting every transaction between their households over the past 3 years. The precise records had settled the matter immediately, leaving Orm with no grounds for his inflated claims, but her contributions went beyond mere bookkeeping. The ledger also recorded innovations she had introduced, a more efficient method for preserving fish that had extended their protein stores, negotiations with distant traders that had secured better prices for their surplus wool, improvements to the grain storage buildings that had reduced losses to vermin and weather. Look at this entry, said Gunnar the Bold, pointing to a line that recorded payment to traveling craftsmen. She hired stonemasons to improve the drainage around the main hall foundation. I thought it was unnecessary expense, but the cellar stayed dry through the worst storms we have had in years. The household's women had initially resented Astrid's assumption of authority over domestic matters, viewing her as an outsider who sought to change established ways. But her improvements had made their work easier and more effective, gradually winning their cooperation and eventually their genuine respect. She does not order us about like a harsh mistress, confided Gudrun, the head cook, to anyone who would listen. She asks our opinions, listens to our concerns, and implements changes only after explaining why they will help us all. When my grandson fell ill, she personally prepared medicines and sat with him through the fever crisis. The ledger documented these acts of kindness as well: payments to healers, gifts to struggling families, contributions to community projects that strengthened the bonds between Bjorn's household and the surrounding settlements. Where other lords maintained loyalty through fear and obligation, Astrid had begun building it through genuine care and mutual benefit. Her most significant innovation had been the establishment of formal trade relationships with settlements that had previously been raided sporadically. Instead of taking tribute through threat of violence, she had negotiated regular exchanges that provided steady income while allowing the tributary communities to prosper and grow stronger rather than weaker over time. A settlement that thrives under our protection can provide tribute for decades, she had explained to skeptical warriors who preferred the immediate gratification of raiding. A settlement that is plundered repeatedly will eventually have nothing left to take, and we will be forced to find new victims or face reduced income. The long-term thinking reflected in every page of her ledger had begun to transform not just Bjorn's wealth, but his reputation. Neighboring jarls, who had once viewed him primarily as a dangerous military threat, now saw him also as a valuable trading partner and political ally. The combination of feared warrior and shrewd administrator made him a more formidable power than either aspect alone could achieve. As Astrid closed the ledger and prepared to lock it away for safekeeping, the afternoon light caught the silver clasp at her throat, reminding all present of her official status in the household. The woman who had begun as an unlikely bedmate had evolved into an indispensable partner in every aspect of ruling their domain. The account ledger was more than a record of transactions. It was proof of her intellectual worth and practical wisdom, qualities that would outlast beauty and passion. The runestone arrived at dawn, carried by a foam-flecked horse whose rider collapsed from exhaustion before delivering his urgent message. Carved into the flat piece of slate were symbols that made Astrid's blood run cold, ancient marks that spoke of danger approaching like winter wolves, swift and merciless. The messenger, once revived with strong ale and warm broth, confirmed what the runes had already proclaimed. "Ships," he gasped, his words broken by the effort of hard riding through the night. "Many ships. Jarl Magnus has called upon his allies. They come with the morning tide." Astrid stared at the stone, its rough surface marked with symbols that predated written words, carrying meanings that cut deeper than any blade. The central rune resembled a storm cloud crossed with spears, a warning of violence approaching from the sea. Surrounding it were smaller marks indicating numbers, directions, and most ominously, the symbol for a funeral pyre. The coalition had been months in the making, she realized now. Magnus's apparent acceptance of his daughter's rejection had been a carefully crafted deception, allowing him time to gather allies while Bjorn was away raiding and could not respond to political maneuvering. The other jarls who had seen their own daughters dismissed in favor of Astrid had found common cause with their shared humiliation. "How many ships did you count?" Astrid asked the messenger, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. 15 longships, possibly more following behind. Jarl Magnus leads them, with Jarl Håkon and Jarl Orm bringing their household warriors. They mean to take your stronghold before Lord Bjorn can return to defend it. The mathematics were brutal and simple. Bjorn had taken his best fighters on the summer raids, leaving behind perhaps 40 men capable of bearing arms, enough to maintain order and defend against bandits, but nowhere near sufficient to withstand a coordinated assault by 300 seasoned warriors. The stone walls of the stronghold were formidable, but not against such overwhelming numbers. Astrid's mind raced through possibilities and calculations with the same methodical precision she brought to managing household accounts. Food stores, weapons availability, potential escape routes, the loyalty of various servants and guards, every factor that might influence their chances of survival demanded immediate consideration. "Gather the household heads," she commanded the messenger. "Every man who can bear arms, every woman who can tend wounded or manage supplies. We have perhaps 6 hours before they arrive." The great hall filled quickly with faces, marked by varying degrees of fear and determination. These people had chosen to remain in Bjorn's service during his absence, trusting in Astrid's leadership and the protection of his reputation. Now that protection was about to be tested in the most direct way possible, "You know why I have called you together," Astrid began, the runestone held prominently in her hands, where all could see its dire message. "Our enemies believe Lord Bjorn's absence makes us vulnerable. They think to take what he has built, to claim his holdings, and dispose of those loyal to him." Murmurs of anger and determination rippled through the gathered crowd. But Astrid raised her hand for silence. "I will not lie to you about our situation. We are outnumbered 3 to 1 by experienced warriors. Our walls are strong but not impregnable. Many of you have families to consider, children and elderly who cannot fight but will suffer if we fail." She paused, letting the weight of their circumstances settle fully before continuing. Anyone who chooses to leave now, to seek safety in the mountains or with distant relatives, will go with my blessing and a purse of silver to ease their journey. There will be no shame in choosing survival over what may prove to be a hopeless fight. The silence stretched long enough for Astrid to fear that her honesty had driven away the support she desperately needed. Then Thorek One-Eye stepped forward, his scarred face set in grim determination. I have served Bjorn Ironwolf for 20 years. Any man who thinks to claim his hall while he is away will have to walk over my corpse first. One by one, others echoed his declaration. The household guards, the craftsmen, even the kitchen staff and stable hands, all chose to remain and defend their home rather than flee to uncertain safety elsewhere. As the sun climbed higher, painting the fjord in shades of gold that might be their last peaceful dawn, Astrid held the runestone against her chest and whispered, a prayer to whatever gods might protect those foolish. Enough to stand against overwhelming odds for the sake of love and loyalty. The broken shield lay propped against the wall of their bedchamber. Its painted dragon split down the middle where an English axe had found its mark. The once proud red and gold design was marred by blood and salt water, the iron rim bent and twisted from impacts that should have killed any man. Yet Bjorn had returned, carried aboard his flagship on a litter improvised from oars and sailcloth, his body bearing the wounds of a battle that had gone catastrophically wrong. 3 days had passed since his unexpected arrival, and still he had not spoken more than necessity demanded. The physical injuries were healing under Astrid's careful tending, the deep gash along his ribs, the sword cut across his thigh, the countless smaller wounds that marked a warrior who had fought against overwhelming odds. But the deeper damage showed in his eyes, in the way he turned away when she tried to meet his gaze, in the hollow silence where his laughter once had been. The English king had prepared a trap. Eric the Wise had explained privately to Astrid, his own face bearing fresh scars from the disastrous raid. Spies had warned him of our coming. Instead of a few village militiamen, we faced trained soldiers with proper weapons and tactics. We lost half our men getting back to the ships. The defeat itself was not what had broken Bjorn's spirit. Warriors understood that battles could be lost, that even the most skilled fighters sometimes faced superior numbers or unexpected circumstances. What haunted him was the knowledge that his tactical errors had cost the lives of men who had trusted his leadership. Warriors who had followed him across the sea only to die on foreign soil because he had grown careless in his confidence. Astrid sat beside his bed in the morning light, her hands busy with mending torn mail while she watched him sleep. Even in rest, his face was drawn with pain that had nothing to do with his physical wounds. The proud warrior who had conquered kingdoms seemed diminished, reduced to something fragile and uncertain. When he finally woke, his first words struck her like a physical blow. You should leave while you still can. The statement was delivered with flat certainty, as if he had been rehearsing it through sleepless nights. Astrid set down her needlework and turned to face him fully, seeing in his expression the same look of desperate hurt she had witnessed in other men who had convinced themselves they were unworthy of love. Should I? And why do you believe that? Because I am not the man you chose to stay with. That man was strong, successful, someone worth the risk of remaining. This man is a failure who leads good warriors to meaningless death, who cannot even protect himself, let alone anyone else. The self-loathing in his voice was so familiar it made her chest ache with recognition. She had heard it in her first husband's words when illness had weakened his body, in her second husband's voice when age had slowed his mind. Men, she had learned, often measured their worth by their ability to provide and protect, and when that ability seemed compromised, they would rather drive away love than risk exposing their vulnerability. Bjorn, she said softly, reaching out to touch his uninjured cheek. He tried to turn away, but she held firm, forcing him to meet her eyes. Do you remember what I told you when we first shared your bed? I'm too old and too tired for games. This is not a game, Astrid. This is reality. I failed my men, failed my own reputation, failed everything that made me worthy of your choice." She moved closer, her fingers tracing the edge of his broken shield where it leaned against the wall. "This shield protected you through how many battles? Kept you alive through how many years of fighting? It broke. It failed when I needed it most. It broke after serving faithfully for longer than most shields last. Its breaking does not erase its years of faithful service." Her hand moved from the shield to rest over his heart, feeling its steady rhythm beneath her palm. A good shield does not become worthless because it finally meets a blow too strong for it to turn aside. Bjorn's eyes searched her face, looking for signs of pity or false reassurance. Instead, he found only the steady acceptance that had first drawn him to her, the rare quality of seeing people as they truly were and choosing to love them anyway. "I could have died on that beach, Astrid. You could have become a widow again, left with nothing." "Yes," she agreed simply. "That is the risk I accepted when I chose to love a warrior. But the alternative, living safely but without love, is not life at all. Merely existence." The scar across Astrid's shoulder blade was a thin white line barely visible in the flickering candlelight, but when she turned to show it to him, Bjorn understood that he was being offered a glimpse into depths she had never revealed to anyone. Her fingers traced the old mark with the same matter-of-fact acceptance she brought to all practical matters. Yet her voice carried the weight of long-buried pain. "My first husband gave me this," she said quietly. Her back still turned to him as she sat on the edge of their bed. Not in anger, but in what he called love. He believed that a woman needed to be reminded of her place, that tenderness would make me weak and disobedient. The revelation struck Bjorn like a physical blow. Recontextualizing everything, he thought he understood about the woman who had chosen to remain by his side. He had assumed her calm acceptance of his intense nature came from inexperience with violence or passion. Now he realized it came from having survived something far worse than his overwhelming desire for possession. "He was a respected man in his community," Astrid continued, her voice steady but distant, as if speaking of someone else's life. "A successful merchant with a reputation for fair dealing and generous charity. No one would have believed that behind closed doors he required absolute submission from his wife and punished any sign of independent thought." Bjorn's hands clenched involuntarily, imagining violence against a man already years dead. The protective rage that surged through him was instinctive and immediate, but Astrid seemed to sense his reaction without turning around. "I learned to be very small in those years," she said. "To anticipate his moods, to speak only when spoken to make myself invisible when his temper was uncertain. I became an expert at reading the signs that preceded violence, at deflecting anger before it could focus on me. How did you escape? Fever took him during a harsh winter. I nursed him faithfully to the end, as a good wife should, and felt nothing but relief when he finally died. The community praised my devotion and mourned my loss, never knowing they were celebrating my liberation." She turned to face him then, her eyes meeting his with the same steady gaze that had first captivated him across his feast hall. "My second husband was everything the first was not, gentle, patient, truly loving. But by then I had learned to recognize the signs of a man's inner nature, to distinguish between love that honored and love that consumed." "And what did you see when you looked at me that first night?" Astrid smiled, the expression transforming her plain features into something approaching beauty. "I saw a man who burned with intensity, yes, but whose fire was directed outward at the world rather than inward at those he claimed to love. I saw someone who commanded through strength rather than fear, who had never learned the difference between passionate devotion and possessive control, because no one had ever been strong enough to teach him." The insight cut deeper than any blade, revealing truths about himself that Bjorn had never examined closely. His previous relationships had failed, not because he was cruel or deliberately harmful, but because he had never learned to distinguish between claiming someone and cherishing them. You stayed because you pitied me. I stayed because I recognized you. Her hand reached out to cover his, her work-roughened fingers warm against his skin. You reminded me of a horse I once saw, magnificent and powerful, but fighting against its own traces because no one had taught it the difference between being broken and being partnered. The metaphor stung with its accuracy, but also offered hope he had never dared consider. And you thought you could teach me this difference? I thought we could learn it together. You see, Bjorn, my first husband's cruelty taught me something valuable about my own nature. I discovered that I am not easily broken, not easily frightened away by intensity or passion. What I cannot tolerate is deliberate cruelty, or the kind of love that seeks to diminish rather than elevate. She moved closer, her hand coming up to trace the line of his jaw with gentle fingers. When you try to drive me away because you believe yourself unworthy, you are making the same mistake my first husband made, deciding for me what I can and cannot handle, what I should and should not choose. And when I overwhelm you with my need, my desire to possess completely, then I will teach you, as I'm teaching you now, that true partnership requires space for both people to breathe and grow. The strongest bonds are not chains that prevent movement, but roots that provide stability while allowing each person to reach toward their own light. The scar on her shoulder blade seemed to glow in the candlelight, a mark of survival rather than defeat, proof that some wounds could heal into wisdom rather than bitterness. The War Council table bore the scars of countless strategy sessions, its ancient oak surface marked with knife cuts where previous generations of warriors had traced battle plans and calculated odds of survival. Tonight, it supported maps drawn on treated leather, wooden markers representing enemy forces, and the grim faces of those who would determine whether Bjorn's legacy would survive the coming storm. The table itself seemed to radiate the weight of history, reminding all present that the decisions made here would echo through generations. 3 days had passed since the coalition's ultimatum arrived, delivered by a messenger who barely concealed his contempt behind diplomatic courtesy. Surrender unconditionally, or face the combined might of 3 Jarls and their allied forces. Submit to judgment for the insult of choosing a common woman over noble daughters, or watch everything built over decades burn to ash. They offer no real terms, reported Eric the Wise, his weathered hands spread across the map that showed enemy positions. Magnus demands your complete submission, the dissolution of all your political alliances, and— he paused, glancing meaningfully at Astrid. The surrender of your woman for public judgment by their assembly. The last condition had sealed any possibility of negotiated peace. Whatever political grievances might have been resolved through compromise, the personal nature of their demand made clear that this was never about territory or trade disputes. This was about humiliation, about powerful men whose pride could not tolerate being refused by someone they deemed inferior. Astrid stood at Bjorn's right hand, her presence at the War Council no longer questioned by even the most traditional of his followers. Her contributions over recent months had proven her worth beyond domestic matters, and her refusal to flee in the face of approaching danger had earned grudging respect from warriors who valued courage above all else. Our scouts report 15 longships anchored in the outer fjord, continued Eric, perhaps 300 fighting men, all equipped for serious warfare rather than quick raiding. They have established a fortified camp on the beach, suggesting they plan for extended siege rather than direct assault. Bjorn studied the wooden markers that represented their enemies, his mind working through possibilities with the tactical brilliance that had made him legendary. The physical wounds from his recent defeat were healing, but more importantly, the spiritual wounds were beginning to close as well. Astrid's refusal to abandon him had restored something essential that he had thought lost forever. They expect us to cower behind our walls until they can starve us out, or find weakness in our defenses, he said, moving markers to represent potential scenarios. A conventional siege favors their superior numbers. Then we do not fight conventionally, suggested Gunnar the Bold. Hit them where and when they least expect it. Use our knowledge of local terrain against their overwhelming force. Thorek One-Eye nodded agreement. The old ways, like our grandfathers used against the Danes when they thought to occupy this coast. Make them pay for every foot of ground, every day of occupation, until the cost becomes too high to bear. Astrid had remained silent during the tactical discussion, but now she spoke with quiet authority. Gentlemen, you are thinking like warriors facing other warriors. But this is not purely a military conflict. It is political theater designed to demonstrate that powerful men cannot be defied without consequence. All eyes turned to her, recognizing the truth in her words. This confrontation was as much about reputation and precedent as it was about territory or revenge. What do you suggest? Bjorn asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. We deny them the satisfaction of the narrative they have constructed. They expect you to respond, as the old Bjorn would have, with overwhelming force and reckless courage. They want you to die gloriously in battle, proving that their way of thinking about women and marriage was correct all along. She moved to the map, her finger tracing routes and positions with surprising tactical understanding. Instead, we demonstrate that a leader who values wise counsel over masculine pride, who builds alliances through respect rather than fear, commands loyalty that their old-fashioned brutality cannot match. You are suggesting we call upon our allies? I am suggesting we remind our allies why supporting you serves their interests better than supporting your enemies. Magnus and his coalition represent the old ways, taking what they want through violence, treating women as property to be distributed among men of proper status. You represent something new, leadership through competence, relationships based on mutual benefit rather than subjugation. The War Council table, scarred by generations of similar discussions, seemed to absorb the weight of this new kind of strategic thinking. The choice was not merely between victory and defeat, but between different visions of what Viking society could become. The signal fire beacon blazed atop the highest watchtower, its smoke rising straight into the windless dawn sky like a dark pillar connecting earth to heaven. The carefully arranged kindling of birch bark and pine resin created the specific pattern of smoke that would be recognized by allies positioned on distant peaks. 3 short bursts, followed by a long continuous plume, repeated at regular intervals. It was a communication system perfected over generations, allowing messages to travel faster than any horse across the mountainous terrain. Astrid climbed the narrow stone steps to the beacon platform where Gunnar the Bold tended the flames with practiced efficiency. Below them spread the fjord where enemy longships lay at anchor, their dragon prows pointed toward shore like predators poised to strike. The morning mist was beginning to lift, revealing the full extent of the coalition forces that had gathered against them. The signal has been acknowledged, Gunnar reported, pointing to answering smoke rising from 3 different mountain peaks. Jarl Thorfinn confirms he brings 40 men. Jarl Leif sends word that his ship will arrive by midday with 30 warriors. Even old Jarl Ragnar has roused himself. 20, veterans who may be grey, but remember how to fight. The beacon fire represented more than simple military communication. It symbolized the network of relationships that Astrid had helped Bjorn cultivate through fare, dealing and mutual respect rather than intimidation and tribute. These allies came not because they feared his anger if they refused, but because they trusted his leadership and benefited from his friendship. 90 additional warriors against 300, Astrid calculated aloud. Still overwhelming odds, but no longer impossible ones. She watched the enemy camp through the clear morning air, noting the careful organization of their position. Magnus and his allies had not made the mistake of underestimating their opposition. Sentries were properly posted, defensive positions had been prepared, and supply lines were secured. This would not be a battle won through surprise or tactical superiority alone. The first assault came with the rising tide, exactly as their scouts had predicted. Longships moved in coordinated formation toward the beach below the stronghold, their crews chanting war songs that carried across the water like thunder rolling down from the mountains. The sound was meant to intimidate, to weaken resolve before the first blow was struck, but Astrid felt only grim determination as she watched death approach their shores. "Are you afraid?" Bjorn asked, joining her on the beacon platform as their own defenders moved to positions along the walls. "Terrified," she admitted honestly, "but not of dying in battle beside you. I fear living in a world where men like Magnus decide which women deserve love and protection based on their birth rather than their worth." The first arrows began to fall as enemy ships reached the shallows, their warriors leaping into surf that ran red with the blood of those who fell to the defenders' return volleys. Astrid and Bjorn descended from the beacon platform to take their places in the battle. But the signal fire continued to burn above them, its smoke carrying messages of defiance to anyone with eyes to see. The fighting was brutal and immediate. Enemy warriors who reached the beach found themselves facing not just superior defensive positions, but defenders motivated by something more than duty or fear. These men fought for a leader who had proven worthy of their loyalty, for homes that had prospered under his rule, for the right to choose their own paths, rather than submit to the arbitrary will of those who claimed authority through birth alone. Astrid took position. On the walls with a bow she had learned to use during long summer evenings when Bjorn was away raiding. Her targets were not the warriors in the front lines, but the commanders who hung back directing the assault, the bannermen whose capture would confuse enemy formations, the hornblowers whose signals coordinated attacks. Each arrow was aimed with methodical precision, chosen to create maximum disruption rather than simply to kill. "She fights like she manages the household," observed Eric the Wise, pausing between sword strokes to watch Astrid's tactical shooting. Every action serves a larger purpose, nothing wasted on emotion or display. The beacon fire above them continued to burn, its message now evolved from call for help to declaration of resistance. As long as that flame blazed against the sky, everyone within sight would know that Bjorn the Ironwolf and his chosen woman still held their ground against those who would force them to submit. The beacon had become a symbol of defiance itself, proof that some bonds could not be broken by threat or violence, that some choices were worth any price to defend. The victory banner rippled in the wind above the highest rampart, its deep blue fabric emblazoned with the silver tree that Astrid had embroidered during those peaceful months before the war. What had begun as decoration for their private chamber had become their battle standard, carried into combat by warriors who understood that they fought not just for territory or treasure, but for the right to choose love over convention, partnership over domination. The decisive moment had come at dawn of the third day, when Magnus himself led a final desperate assault against the main gate. The coalition's superior numbers had been steadily eroded by the defenders' tactical brilliance and the arrival of Bjorn's allies, but the enemy still possessed enough strength for one crushing blow that might break the siege in their favor. Bjorn and Astrid stood together on the battlements as the enemy formed up for their ultimate attack, their hands briefly touching as they prepared for what might be their final moments together. Below them, 3 days of brutal fighting had littered the approaches to their stronghold, with evidence of the price both sides had paid for their principles. "If we fall today," Bjorn said quietly, his eyes fixed on the massed warriors preparing to charge, "let it be said that we fell as partners, not as master and possession. We will not fall," Astrid replied with the calm certainty that had first drawn him to her. "Not because we are stronger than they are, but because we fight for something worth preserving, while they fight only to punish us for defying their expectations. The enemy charge came with the fury of desperate men who knew this was their last opportunity for victory. Magnus led from the front, his sword gleaming in the morning light as he screamed war cries meant to inspire his followers and intimidate his enemies. Behind him, the combined warriors of 3 jarls threw themselves against defences that had already withstood more punishment than their builders had ever imagined possible, but the defenders had advantages beyond strong walls and superior positions. They fought with the coordination of men and women who had worked together, planned together, shared both prosperity and hardship under leadership they respected rather than feared. When Astrid called out warnings about enemy movements, archers adjusted their aim without question. When Bjorn ordered tactical repositioning, warriors moved with the smooth efficiency of a household that functioned as a single organism. The turning point came when Magnus, in his fury to reach Bjorn personally, overextended himself beyond the protection of his shield-bearers. Astrid's arrow, aimed with the same methodical precision she brought to all tasks, took him in the shoulder and sent him sprawling among the corpses of his own men. The sight of their leader fallen broke the spirit of the coalition forces, who had followed him more from fear than loyalty. What followed was not massacre, but demonstration. As enemy warriors threw down their weapons and begged for quarter, Bjorn granted it freely, understanding that mercy shown to defeated enemies would be remembered by future opponents. The victory banner above them proclaimed not just military triumph, but the success of an entirely different approach to leadership and conflict. "Jarl Magnus," Bjorn said, standing over his wounded enemy as Astrid tended the arrow wound with the same skill she had shown caring for her own people. "You came here to punish me for choosing love over politics. Instead, you have proven that a leader supported by willing followers will always triumph over one who rules through fear and tradition alone." Magnus, weakened by blood loss and the bitter taste of defeat, could only stare up at the woman he had sought to destroy, now working to preserve his life. The irony was not lost on him, Astrid's gentle hands cleaning his wounds, while his own supporters fled or surrendered rather than continue fighting for his cause. The victory celebration that followed was unlike any feast Bjorn had ever hosted. Instead of displaying captured treasure or counting enemy dead, his people gathered to honor the bonds that had made triumph possible. Warriors who had bled together shared ale with servants who had tended them. Allies who had answered the beacon fire were welcomed as family rather than merely military assets. Astrid stood beside Bjorn as he addressed the assembled crowd, the victory banner streaming above them like a promise of better days to come. The tree she had embroidered in peaceful times had become a symbol of roots planted deep enough to weather any storm, of growth that came from partnership rather than domination. Today we have proven that love freely chosen is stronger than tradition blindly followed, Bjorn declared, his arm around the woman who had changed everything about his understanding of strength and victory. Let all who hear this tale remember that the greatest conquests are not of lands or enemies, but of our own capacity to grow beyond what we thought possible. The banner continued to fly long after the celebration ended, a permanent reminder that some battles are worth fighting, not for what they destroy, but for what they allow to flourish. The wedding crown was nothing like the elaborate golden circlets worn by Jarl's daughters at their political marriages, crafted from simple silver by the same artisan who had made Astrid's cloak clasp. It bore no precious gems or intricate engravings, only the clean lines of honest craftsmanship and the warm glow of metal shaped with genuine care. When Bjorn placed it upon Astrid's graying hair during the hand-fasting ceremony, the assembled crowd understood they were witnessing something unprecedented. A powerful man choosing to honor a woman not for her beauty, wealth, or political connections, but for her character and partnership. 6 months had passed since the victory over Magnus and his coalition. Months spent rebuilding not just physical damage from the siege, but establishing new relationships with neighbors who had watched their unconventional love story unfold with fascination and growing respect. The hand-fasting ceremony drew representatives from dozens of settlements, many arriving not out of political obligation, but from genuine curiosity about the couple whose choices had challenged every assumption about how power and affection should intersect. "I have lived long enough to see many marriages," declared Jarl Thorfinn, one of their staunchest allies, as he rose to offer the traditional blessing. Some were made for alliance, some for wealth, some for heirs to carry on bloodlines. But this is the first I have witnessed that was made simply because two people discovered they were stronger together than either could be alone. Astrid's hands, adorned now with the simple silver crown, remained the same practical instruments that had managed his household, tended his wounds, and drawn the bow that helped win their decisive battle. The crown did not transform her into something she was not. It merely acknowledged publicly what had long been true in private. She was his chosen partner in every sense, elevated not by ceremony, but by the daily proof of her worth. The wedding feast itself reflected the same principles that had guided their relationship. Instead of the competitive display of wealth that marked most noble celebrations, this gathering emphasized abundance shared rather than hoarded. Tables groaned beneath food, prepared by many hands working together. Entertainment came from local musicians who played because they loved their craft rather than because they sought patronage. And gifts were offered freely rather than calculated for maximum political advantage. "You have taught us something valuable," Eric the Wise observed as the evening wound toward its peaceful conclusion. "That a leader's greatest strength lies not in commanding fear or inspiring awe, but in creating conditions where others can flourish alongside him." Bjorn looked across the hall at faces illuminated by firelight and genuine happiness, warriors who had found purpose beyond conquest, servants who had become valued colleagues, neighbors who had discovered that cooperation served them better than competition. The hand-fasting ceremony had become a celebration of community as much as marriage, proof that their personal relationship had created ripples extending far beyond their private happiness. As the formal festivities concluded and guests began preparing for departure, Bjorn and Astrid found themselves alone on the ramparts where they had stood together during the siege. The silver crown caught starlight as Astrid gazed out over the fjord, now peaceful under a canopy of brilliant stars. "Do you regret anything?" Bjorn asked, still finding it difficult to believe that his turbulent past had led to such unexpected contentment. Astrid considered the question with her characteristic thoughtfulness. "I regret that it took us both so many years and so much pain to learn what we needed to know about love and partnership. But I cannot regret the journey that brought us to this moment." She turned to face him, the simple crown framing features that had grown more beautiful to him with each passing day. "You were never the problem, Bjorn, nor were the women who left. The problem was believing that love could be taken like treasure or won like battles. True partnership must be offered and accepted freely, day after day, choice by choice." The silver crown gleamed in the starlight, but its true value lay not in the precious metal or skilled craftsmanship. It represented recognition of something far more valuable, the rare discovery of two people who made each other better, who faced the world as partners rather than master and possession, who had learned that the strongest bonds are forged not in passion alone, but in the daily decision to choose each other again and again. "This is my place," Astrid had declared on that first morning, and time had proven the truth of her words, not because she had conquered him or been conquered by him, but because they had discovered together that some places in the world are meant to be shared. Some victories are won only through partnership, and some love stories begin not with fairy tale romance, but with the simple courage to stay when staying matters most.